Carlos always dreamed of more. At just 18 years old, he spent his days sitting in a small shoe-shining chair in a corner of the city's bustling luxury shopping mall. The contrast between his world and that of the customers rushing past made him feel small. The elegance of his clothes and the wealth of his accessories drew attention to his simple appearance, a worn uniform and an expression of determination that sometimes became a burden. Life at home was not easy. His widowed mother worked long shifts as a cleaner to support the family, while his sister, still in school, dreamed of becoming a doctor. Carlos felt responsible for providing a better future for them. With this in mind, he dedicated every penny he earned to his family, hoping to one day study business and open his own business. At the mall, Carlos became known for his skill at shining shoes. He had a special way of taking care of each customer, listening to their stories while polishing their shoes. His kindness and attention caught the attention of some, but most walked right past him without looking. He accepted this with a smile, believing that what mattered was doing good. One morning, as he was getting ready for another day at work, Carlos thought about how different life could be. He dreamed of one day putting on a suit, sitting at an office desk, and making important decisions. But at that moment, he was just tightening the laces of his worn-out shoes, knowing that his job as a shoeshine boy was the only thing he had to help his family. In the early afternoon, the mall was bustling with people, and Carlos watched the customers passing by, each one immersed in their own concerns. He was used to hearing the laughter and lively conversations around him, but one day, amidst all this noise, he noticed a small gesture that would change his day forever. An elderly woman, with white hair and a tired expression, was struggling to find change in her purse to pay for the gas in her car. Carlos, in a moment of compassion, decided to intervene. With a warm smile, he approached her and, in a spontaneous gesture, offered to cover the remaining amount. "You can count on me," he said, feeling good about helping someone in need. The elderly woman smiled gratefully, and her eyes lit up at the unexpected kindness she had encountered. To Carlos, it was a small gesture, but to the elderly woman, it meant a lot. For a few moments, he forgot about the hardships he faced. The act of generosity seemed like a small light in the darkness. But, as life often does, what seemed like a good deed would end up leading him down a painful path. As the day progressed, the mall began to empty, and Carlos felt that his good deed would be recognized. However, he did not imagine that his generosity would soon become a weight on his shoulders. As he finished polishing a pair of shiny leather shoes, an elegant and arrogant man approached. It was Alberto, a businessman known for his coldness and the way he treated others. Alberto sat down, and Carlos began to work. However, what should have been a normal service quickly turned into something unbearable. Alberto, with a look of contempt, made sarcastic comments about Carlos' work. He ridiculed him, throwing sharp words as if they were knives, belittling his effort and dedication. The scene unfolding in the small shoeshine chair was not just a confrontation between two worlds. It was a mirror that reflected the inequalities of society, the lack of respect, and the ability of one man to place himself above another simply because of his social position. Carlos tried to ignore the insults, but the humiliation began to weigh on him, like a shadow that threatened to swallow his light. When Alberto finally stood up, his expression was one of disdain. He threw a paltry tip on the table and, in a loud voice, shouted at the security guards, "This guy is bothering the customers. Kick him out." Carlos felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. What should have been just another day at work had turned into a public nightmare. The looks of contempt from other customers became unbearable. He was thrown out of the mall, and his dignity was taken away with him. As Carlos walked through the streets, humiliation burned in his chest, and tears of anger and sadness streamed down his face. The good deed he had done for the old woman now felt like a heavy burden, and he wondered if he would ever be able to regain his self-confidence. The path back home was a maze of emotions that Carlos could not control. The streets, which had once seemed familiar, now became a desert of loneliness and sadness. He walked with his hands in his pockets, trying to protect himself from the cold that seemed to settle not only in the air, but also in his heart. With each step, the humiliation he had faced resonated in his mind, like an incessant echo of disdain and contempt. When he arrived home, he found his mother and sister at the table, eating dinner. The smell of rice and beans mixed with the aroma of hope that always permeated the house, but at that moment, Carlos felt that hope had faded. He forced a smile, but his sister, noticing something different, gave him a worried look. "What happened, Carlos?" she asked, while their mother looked on with an expression of curiosity and apprehension. Carlos hesitated, He didn't want them to worry. But the truth weighed like a brick on his chest. With a deep sigh, he decided to tell them what had happened. As the words came out, his voice shook, and tears began to stream down his face. He talked about Alberto, about the humiliation, and about how he felt like the ground had disappeared from under his feet. His mother, listening intently, couldn't hide the sadness in her eyes. She knew how hard her son worked, and how he always strove to do good. "Carlos, you're better than that. That person doesn't represent what you're worth. You have a good heart, and that's what matters," she said, trying to comfort him. But her words seemed weak compared to the emotional toll he had taken. That night, Carlos lay in bed, thoughts swirling through his head like a storm. He couldn't understand how one person could have so much power over his emotional state. "Why did I let this affect me so much?" he thought in frustration. He wanted to believe that he could overcome this, but the pain of humiliation was deep and lingering. The next few days were difficult. Carlos still went to the mall, but the vibrant energy he used to feel was gone. He found himself working mechanically, without the sparkle in his eyes that he once had. Customers noticed him less, and some even whispered to each other, remembering what had happened. Humiliation seemed to follow Carlos like an unwanted shadow. One morning, as he was getting ready for another day, he overheard a conversation between two men who were sitting on a nearby bench. They were talking about how unfair life could be, and how some people never learned to respect others. Carlos felt a pang in his heart. The conversation, although it did not directly involve him, touched on his pain. At that moment, something changed inside him. Carlos realized that he could no longer allow Alberto to have control over his life. He decided that no matter what happened, he would not let himself be defeated. The idea of getting back on his feet began to germinate in his mind, but he knew that he would need courage and determination to do so. The next day brought new hope. Carlos arrived at the mall with his head held high and a new purpose. He dedicated himself to his work. With even more determination, focusing on what really mattered, the satisfaction of his customers and the joy of his family. He began to see each shoe he polished as an opportunity to leave his mark, to show that his dignity could not be taken away by one person. And so the days went by. Carlos began to receive compliments from clients who noticed his changed attitude. He was more confident, stronger. His mother's words echoed in his mind, "You have a good heart." This became his mantra, a reminder that he was more than the humiliation he had faced. One morning, while he was chatting with a regular customer, Carlos spotted Alberto entering the mall. His heart raced as he saw the man who had caused him so much pain. Alberto seemed oblivious to Carlos' presence, but for him, this moment was a test of endurance. With a mix of nervousness and determination, Carlos decided that he would face the situation. Alberto walked over to the same place where Carlos worked, and as he was getting ready to sit down, he made a gesture that made Carlos's blood run cold. He turned to a customer who was sitting next to him and made a sarcastic joke about shoeshiners. Carlos felt heat rise to his face, but this time, instead of letting it get him down, he took a deep breath and continued working, deciding that he would not be another victim. The tension was palpable. Carlos didn't want to ignore the pain of his past, but he also didn't want it to dictate his future. He focused on polishing the shoes at hand, knowing that his dignity was now firmly anchored in his character, not in the opinion of some arrogant man. When the job was done, Carlos stood up and looked directly at Alberto. There was no hatred in his eyes, but a quiet determination that spoke louder than any words. He turned to the customer, who had been the butt of the jokes, and smiled. "May I take care of your shoes now, sir?" he asked, his voice firm and calm. The customer nodded, and Carlos set to work, oblivious to Alberto's presence. The scene unfolded in awkward silence, but Carlos knew he was taking the first step toward recovery. The humiliation still stung, but he was determined not to let it define who he was. That night, as he prepared to sleep, Carlos felt a lightness in his heart. He still had a long way to go, but at least he had regained some of his dignity, and that, for now, was enough. Days passed, but Carlos's inner struggle didn't completely disappear. Although he had found new focus and renewed determination, the memories of the humiliation still hung over him like a heavy cloud. With every smile he offered his clients, there was an inner voice that whispered that he could never truly let go of the past. It tormented him, creating a cycle of self-doubt that became increasingly difficult to break. One morning, while cleaning a customer's shoes, Carlos overheard a conversation between two women sitting nearby. They were talking about an upcoming event at the mall, a talent competition where contestants would have the chance to showcase their skills to the public and, hopefully, win a cash prize. Carlos heard the excitement in their voices, and for a moment, felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this could be his chance to shine. But the voice of doubt quickly made itself heard, reminding him of the humiliation he had faced and the fear of failure. That afternoon, as he drove home, he decided he couldn't let fear get the better of him again. The competition seemed like the perfect chance to reassert himself and prove to himself that he was capable of more than just shining shoes. However, the idea of putting himself out there in front of an audience made him nervous. He had no experience performing and had always been shy in front of large groups. That evening, after an exhausting day, Carlos sat at the table with his family. They were talking excitedly about the competition, and his sister was particularly enthusiastic. "Carlos, you should enter. You always speak so well and have such great ideas," she exclaimed, encouraging him. His mother smiled in support of the idea, but Carlos just shook his head, unable to express his insecurities. "I don't know girls. What would I have to show for it? I'm just a shoeshine boy," he replied, his voice tinged with despondency. But deep inside, there was a small voice begging to be heard, a part of him that wanted to scream that he was more than that. The internal conflict left him exhausted. The following days were marked by this internal battle. Carlos watched the competition from afar, his hopes and fears intertwining. He noticed the other participants rehearsing and laughing, while he remained on the sidelines, hesitant. The competition was only a few days away, and the pressure was building like a balloon about to burst. One night, as he tried to sleep, anxiety kept him awake. He sat up in bed and began writing in a notebook he used to record his thoughts. He began writing about his dreams, his fears, and the humiliation he had faced. With each word, he felt a pressure lift, as if he were releasing a weight he had been carrying for a long time. He realized that he could not let the humiliation of his past define him, that the only way to overcome it was to face his fears head-on. The next morning, Carlos decided that he would enter the competition. He didn't know exactly what he would present, but the determination he had cultivated over the past few days drove him to make this decision. When he arrived at the mall, his excitement was through the roof. He felt like a performer about to go on stage, surrounded by anticipation and pressure. But this time, he wasn't just about to perform. He was about to show the world that Carlos the Shoeshine boy had value. Once he signed up and received a number, Carlos began to observe the other contestants. He saw talented dancers, singers, and artists who made the audience roar. The comparison almost threw him off balance again, but he reminded himself that the competition was not about being the best, but about expressing yourself and being true to yourself. The day of the event arrived, and the mall was packed. The energy in the air was electric, and Carlos felt a mix of anxiety and excitement. When it was his turn to go on stage, his heart was beating in his chest like a drum. He took a deep breath and walked up to the stage, looking out at the audience who were watching him intently. Instead of a traditional presentation, Carlos decided to share his story. He spoke about his struggles, his dreams, and the humiliation he had faced, but also about his determination to get back on his feet. With his words, he wanted to show that despite the difficulties, he never gave up. His voice was shaking at first, but as he spoke, his confidence grew. The audience began to pay attention, and at the end, he ended with a call for kindness and understanding among people. The reaction was instantaneous. The audience rose to their feet in applause. Carlos felt a mixture of relief and joy, as if he had finally released the weight he was carrying. He had exposed himself, not only to the audience, but to himself. He realized that true achievement was not in being perfect, but in being authentic. As he walked off the stage, Carlos felt renewed. He had faced his fears, and in doing so, he had reclaimed a part of himself that he thought he had lost. He knew he still had a long way to go, but at that moment, the humiliation no longer held sway. The experience had become a new foundation upon which he could build his dreams. When he returned to his family, he found his mother and sister smiling and cheering. They hugged him, and he realized that their love and support had always been what really mattered. The kindness he had given to that elderly woman had returned to him in ways he could never have imagined. That day, Carlos made a promise to himself. He would not let his past experiences define him, but rather the lessons he had learned from them. He was determined to continue his journey, to pursue his dreams, and to help others along the way. After all, true victory lay in rising after falling and never losing sight of who we truly were. Carlos felt different after the competition, not just because of how he had performed in front of an audience, but because of the way he had expressed himself. The words he had spoken echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of his inner strength. Cheered on by strangers and supported by his family, he now had a new perspective on himself and his capabilities. The experience had become a turning point in his life, but it also meant that he needed to rebuild the confidence that had been shaken by the humiliation. Over the next few days, he threw himself even more into his work at the mall. The energy he brought to polishing shoes was palpable. Carlos had become a respected figure among customers and colleagues alike. His positive attitude attracted people, and he began to bond with other workers at the mall. Conversations about life, dreams, and challenges began to emerge during breaks, and the loneliness that had previously enveloped him was replaced by a sense of community. One afternoon, while chatting with a co-worker, Carlos heard about a public speaking course being offered in his city. The idea of improving his communication skills and gaining confidence in public seemed like a perfect opportunity. He hesitated for a moment, but remembered the promise he had made to himself not to let fear get the better of him. Without thinking twice, he decided to sign up. The course was intense and challenging. Carlos had to face his nerves and insecurities again, but this time, there was one crucial difference. He was determined to grow. The classes were full of practical exercises and constructive feedback, and with each session, he felt more confident. His instructors were encouraging and offered valuable tips on how to communicate effectively. Over time, Carlos began to realize that public speaking was not just about speaking well, but about connecting with people. He learned how to use personal stories to captivate his audience, the importance of body language, and how to convey emotions through his words. Each class brought new challenges, but also new victories. The fear that had once paralyzed him began to dissipate, replaced by a growing excitement. While attending classes, Carlos also began to get involved in local events where he could put what he was learning into practice. He volunteered to speak at small gatherings and even community events. The first few presentations were difficult. Anxiety still haunted him, but he remembered the sense of empowerment he had felt during the competition. He remembered the words of his mother and sister, always reminding him that true strength came from within. One night, after an event where he felt more comfortable speaking, Carlos was approached by a woman who had seen his presentation. She was an event planner and was impressed by the way he connected with the audience. "You have a natural talent, Carlos. Have you ever thought about doing more events? I think you have what it takes to stand out," she said with an encouraging smile. That conversation reignited a spark within Carlos. He realized that, in addition to his own personal journey of overcoming obstacles, he could use his skills to help others who had gone through similar experiences. He began to envision the possibility of giving motivational speeches, sharing his story, and encouraging others to find their voice and inner strength. The idea of becoming a motivational speaker seemed far-fetched and challenging, but he was determined to follow through. With the support of his event planner, Carlos began building a presence on social media, sharing his experiences, reflections, and tips on confidence and resilience. He wasn't an expert, but he was willing to be authentic and vulnerable, sharing his journey rather than just offering solutions. Meanwhile, his connection with his family grew stronger. He talked more openly about his feelings and challenges, and the dynamic between them began to change. Carlos found that his dreams and aspirations were now a common topic at his meals, something he had previously felt he could not share. His sister became a great supporter, always encouraging him to keep going and face his fears. Her presence became a constant reminder that he was not alone in his journey. As time went on, Carlos began to receive positive feedback from his social media followers. They could relate to his struggles and stories, and he felt like he was making a difference, even if it was a small one. This became an extra motivation to keep showing up and sharing his message. He committed to participating in local events and speaking out about the importance of believing in yourself and getting back up after a setback. One morning, as he was getting ready for yet another event, Carlos looked in the mirror and saw a different man. He was more confident, stronger, and more comfortable in his own skin. The insecurities were still there, but now he faced them with a new perspective. He was no longer the shy, embarrassed boy. He was a man who had faced challenges and now had a mission. The day of the event arrived, and Carlos was excited and nervous at the same time. As he stepped onto the stage, he felt adrenaline rush through his body. But instead of letting his anxiety get the better of him, he took a deep breath and remembered all the times he had overcome his fears. He began to speak, and the words flowed like a river, full of emotion and sincerity. As he spoke, he saw familiar faces in the audience, including his mother and sister. Their support filled him with confidence, and he threw himself into the moment. With every laugh and applause, Carlos felt like he was fulfilling his promise to never let past humiliation dictate who he was. He was living his truth and inspiring others to do the same. At the end of the performance, the audience gave a standing ovation. Carlos smiled, and as he looked around at the faces of those cheering him on, he knew he had found his purpose. He wasn't just a shoeshine boy, he was a storyteller, an inspirer, someone who could help others find their own strength and voice. That night, when he returned home, Carlos felt lighter than ever. He had rebuilt his confidence and, in doing so, created a new path for himself. The future was still uncertain, but now he was ready to face it, one step at a time. After his inspiring presentation, Carlos felt he had reached an important milestone in his journey of self-discovery and overcoming obstacles. The support and applause from the audience still resonated in his mind, like an echo of validation. He was more than motivated, he was energized to take the next steps on his new path. With his confidence growing, he decided it was time to step up his journey as a motivational speaker. Over the next few days, Carlos began planning his future. He signed up for more events, sought out workshops and opportunities to share his story. Each new presentation was a chance to grow and learn, and he felt at home in front of an audience. For him, telling his story was not just a way to express himself, but a way to connect with people who were facing their own struggles. Meanwhile, life at the mall went on. Carlos threw himself into his work with greater dedication, transforming his Shoeshine booth into a vibrant space full of life. He began putting up small posters with motivational messages and self-help tips, which caught the attention of customers. The words of encouragement became part of the atmosphere, drawing people not only to have their shoes shined, but also to share stories and experiences. Carlos had become a confidant to many, a friend who listened and offered advice. One afternoon, an older man who often passed by the mall sat down in the Shoeshine chair. Carlos greeted him warmly, and as he worked on his shoes, they began to talk. The man, named Seu Jorge, had a sad look in his eyes and carried a visible weight on his shoulders. The conversation flowed naturally, and Carlos felt the need to help. "You seem worried, Mr. Jorge. What's going on?" Carlos asked, as he carefully applied the polish. The man sighed and, after a moment of hesitation, began to vent about his financial difficulties and the feeling that he had lost hope. He didn't know how to get back on his feet, and his words reflected a desperation that Carlos recognized well. Carlos listened intently, and something inside him stirred. He remembered his own struggles and feelings of being lost. He felt an urgency to convey the message he had learned on his journey. "Mr. Jorge, we all face challenges. But there is always a way. Sometimes you need to find a new purpose. Have you ever thought about how you can use your experiences to help others?" Carlos asked sincerely. The conversation continued, and Carlos began to share his own story of overcoming. He saw Seu Jorge's eyes light up as he listened, and he realized that hope was beginning to emerge again. The man seemed lighter, and by the end of the conversation, Carlos saw a smile appear on his face. It was a small step, but for both of them, it meant that change was possible. Over the next few days, Carlos continued to engage with Seu Jorge. They became friends, and the Shoeshine boy began helping the man restructure his finances, offering practical and emotional advice. Together, they began to devise a plan of action so that Seu Jorge could get back on his feet. This experience solidified the idea that Carlos was destined to help others, and he committed to doing so on a larger scale. With the encouragement of Seu Jorge and his family, Carlos decided to create a community lecture series. He wanted to create a space where people could come together, share their experiences, and find hope. To do this, he began working on a project that would combine his passion for storytelling with his desire to help. He remembered some of the stories he had heard from other Shoeshiners and decided it was time to give voice to those narratives as well. The project quickly took shape. Carlos began organizing monthly meetings at a local community center where people could share their stories and learn from one another. He invited Seu Jorge to be one of the speakers, and together they created a welcoming environment where mutual support became the basis of the meetings. The impact was immediate. Each meeting brought together more people, and the stories shared were full of vulnerability and strength. As the project grew, Carlos began receiving invitations to speak at local schools and businesses. He was becoming a beacon in the community, someone who brought hope and inspiration. The messages that had once been bottled up inside him were now spreading, and he felt like he was making a difference. However, he also faced challenges. Some people still saw his past as an obstacle, and there were those who doubted his ability to inspire others. At one particularly important event, Carlos was invited to speak at a school where many young people were struggling emotionally and financially. The principal was eager for Carlos to share his story, but he also knew that expectations were high. As he took the stage, Carlos felt a wave of nervousness, but he remembered the support he had always received from his family and friends. He began to speak, and as he described his journey of humiliation and overcoming, he noticed that many young people were listening attentively. As he shared his struggles and how he had found strength in the little things, he saw tears in some of the students' eyes. The connection was palpable. Carlos spoke about the importance of not letting yourself be defined by past mistakes and seeking support from the community. After the talk, many students approached him, thanking him for his words and sharing their own stories. Carlos felt moved, because the connection he had created with these young people was something he never imagined he could have. He realized that by opening his heart and vulnerability, he was truly touching people's lives. Over time, Carlos saw the positive impact of his project. Many people, like Seu Jorge, began to get back on their feet and find new directions in their lives. The sense of community and support he had cultivated was like a safety net for all those who participated. Carlos became a symbol of resilience, and his story began to circulate, inspiring not only his city, but also other communities around it. However, even with his success, Carlos remembered where he came from. He always made a point of returning to the mall where it all began. On one of his visits, he decided to organize a celebration event, inviting all the customers and friends he had made along the way. It was a way of giving back to the community that had supported him through his most difficult time. On the day of the event, the mall was vibrant with laughter and joy. Carlos was surrounded by friends, family, and those he had helped along his journey. The atmosphere was filled with gratitude, and everyone was ready to celebrate his stories of overcoming obstacles. Carlos took the stage and, as he looked out over the crowd, he felt a wave of emotion. He realized that everything he had endured had brought him to this moment. The humiliation was no longer a burden, but an important part of his journey. "Today we celebrate not just my victories, but the victories of all of us," Carlos said, his voice choked with emotion. "Each of you has a story, and it is our ability to connect and support each other that makes us stronger. Never underestimate the power of your voice and your experience." The audience applauded, and the feeling of unity and strength spread like wildfire, lighting up the room. With that event, Carlos solidified his role as an agent of change in his community. He had found his mission in life, which was to inspire others to find their own voices and speak out for their stories. The shift he experienced was not just personal, it was a revolution that extended to everyone around him. Thus, Carlos, the Shoeshine boy who had once felt humiliated, became a beacon of hope and motivation, a true testament that overcoming was possible. He had discovered not only his inner strength, but also the beauty of helping others find theirs. And most importantly, he learned that, no matter the circumstances, there is always a light at the end of the tunnel, waiting to be discovered. After the celebration event at the mall, Carlos' life took a new direction. The success of his lectures and community meetings had placed him in a position of influence and responsibility, and he was determined not to waste this opportunity. The idea of leaving a legacy of inspiration and empowerment became one of his main motivations. With the help of Seu Jorge and other friends he had met along the way, Carlos decided to expand his speaking engagements to include training workshops and mentoring programs. He wanted people to not only hear inspiring stories, but also learn practical skills that would help them overcome their challenges. The goal was clear: to empower the community so that they could face adversity and build a better future. The meetings began to include a variety of activities. Carlos began inviting experts in areas such as personal finance, career development, and mental health to join him for talks. Each month brought a new topic, and the audience began to grow. People of all ages were coming together to learn and be inspired. Carlos found that the stories he shared not only helped him, but also created a space for others to feel safe opening up about their own experiences. One of the most impactful stories came from a young woman named Anna. She was a high school student who, despite her promising grades and abilities, was facing a series of family issues that left her feeling unmotivated. At one of the meetings, she stood up and shared her struggles. Carlos listened attentively, and at the end, encouraged her to attend one of the workshops on dealing with anxiety and building confidence. Anna was hesitant, but with the support of the group, she decided to give it a try. Over the next few months, Anna transformed in remarkable ways. Not only did she start to actively participate in meetings, but she also became an influential voice within the group. With the support of Carlos and the other participants, she entered a public speaking competition at school, where she had the chance to share her own story. Anna's success was not only a reflection of her own hard work, but also an example of the positive impact that Carlos' project was having. Carlos felt immense pride as he watched Anna develop and flourish. Her transformation reminded him of his own journey and made him realize that by helping others, he was also helping himself. Every story of overcoming, every laugh shared, every tear shed was a piece of the mosaic he was creating in the community. The project began to attract the attention of local media. Journalists and bloggers began reporting on the meetings, and Carlos's movement gained a wider platform. The recognition brought new challenges, but also new opportunities. Carlos was invited to participate in radio interviews and podcasts, where he could share his vision and experiences. He was becoming a respected voice in the fight against stigmatization and in favor of resilience. However, as the project grew, Carlos realized that the demand for support was greater than he could provide alone. He began to consider formalizing his initiative by creating an NGO dedicated to empowering and inspiring the community. This thought excited him, but also a little apprehensive. He knew that taking a project of this magnitude forward would require careful planning and the involvement of more people. Meanwhile, SEU Jorge, always by his side, became a valuable mentor to Carlos. He helped guide new participants, sharing his own story and encouraging them to find their voices. The friendship between the two solidified, and Carlos began to see SEU Jorge not only as a friend, but as a true partner in the mission to transform lives. One day, while discussing future plans, Jorge mentioned the importance of having a diverse team that could help expand the scope of the project. "Carlos, we need people who can bring new ideas, experiences, and skills. That can make all the difference," he said. Jorge's words resonated with Carlos, who realized it was time to assemble a team that could help him realize his vision. With the idea in mind, Carlos began reaching out to people he knew who shared his passion for helping others. He organized a meeting with a small group of friends and colleagues who had all excelled in their own journeys. Everyone was excited about joining forces to create something bigger and more impactful. During the meeting, Carlos shared his vision for forming a nonprofit and how it could provide even more meaningful support to the community. The energy in the room was palpable. Everyone was excited about the prospect of taking the next step and making a real difference. Ideas began to flow, and a team began to form. With the support of friends and new collaborators, Carlos began to develop a strategic plan for the nonprofit. They discussed goals, potential partnerships, and ways to raise funds. With each meeting, the vision took shape, and the excitement grew. After weeks of intense planning, Carlos and his team finally formalized the NGO, naming it Voices of Hope. The name reflected their mission to empower people to find their voices and share their stories. The organization's launch was planned as a grand event, and Carlos was eager to see his vision come to fruition. The launch day arrived, and the event was a success. The community came together to celebrate the new phase of the project. Carlos took the stage, his heart pounding, but now with unshakable confidence. He spoke about the journey that had brought him to this point, about the importance of each person present and the impact they could have on each other. The audience was engaged, and the energy was contagious. During the event, Anna, now a confident and articulate young woman, was invited to share her own experience with the new NGO. As she took the stage, she looked at Carlos and smiled. The words that came out of her mouth were powerful, and the audience was mesmerized. "Carlos didn't just help me find my voice, he taught me that my story matters. Each of us has a legacy to leave," she said, and the tears of many in the audience were a testament to the impact those words had. Carlos felt emotional as he listened to Anna, remembering how it all began. He had transformed himself from a humble Shoeshine boy into a community leader, and he was determined to continue his mission of inspiring and empowering others. A sense of accomplishment and gratitude flooded his heart. With the launch of the NGO, a new journey began for Carlos and his team. Voices of Hope quickly gained notoriety in the community, attracting the attention of people who wanted to get involved and contribute. Carlos now had the platform he needed to expand his impact and help even more people find their voices. The workshops, lectures, and mentoring programs became an integral part of the community's life. Carlos felt that he was finally fulfilling his purpose. He had transformed his pain into power and was now a source of light for many who needed support. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Carlos not only saw the transformation of others, but also his own. The NGO became an extension of his own life, and he committed each day to continue being a beacon of hope, showing that no matter the challenges, it is always possible to rise up and find the strength to move forward.